going. So I like to introduce economic behaviors in terms of a supermarket. When you go up to a supermarket, you are in a queue, in a line of people, and what is the goal of every person in the supermarket where the checkout counter is concerned? You want to pay for your stuff, and you want to do that as quickly as you possibly can. And so your goal in the supermarket queue is to choose the line that is going to get you through the supermarket in the most time efficient way you can think of. So what are the things that you look for as you're approaching all of the shopping lines? So the first thing is shorter lines. If there's 3 potential lines, one of them has 5 people, one of them has 3 people, one of them has 1 person, you're probably more likely going to go to the one with 1 person, unless they have a huge thing that is just like overflowing with groceries. They have 8 kids and they're shopping for the next 3 weeks. And then you're like, I'm not going to go to that line. It's going to take that person forever to get through and get all that stuff checked. I might look at one of these other 2 lines because maybe there are 3 people or 5 people, but maybe each of these 3 people have 2 items each. So they'll go through much quicker than this person will. And what other cues might you look for? How fast the clerk is going. So some checkout people are quicker than others. They remember all the produce codes, et cetera, and so there might be variation from one checker to another checker. If you normally shop at Price Chopper, but you find yourself at Hy-Vee, are you going to have any idea who's going to be fastest? Probably not. So that's information that you don't have access to. If, on the other hand, you shop at Hy-Vee all the time, like I do, that's where I mainly do my grocery shopping, I know who the slow checkers are because I see them. And I've had the experience of prior experience getting in that line and going, oh my gosh, I chose the wrong line. And then I look at the person checking, I'm like, I'm going to remember you. I see you. You are slow. Next time, I'm going someplace else. What other things might you use to give you clues as to which of these lines you should get in? I look at the amount of produce. It takes longer to check produce than it does to check canned goods and boxed goods because you have to know what the produce is. What do checkers never know the difference between? Parsley and cilantro. Parsley and cilantro stumps checkers every time. They look at it, is this parsley or cilantro? I'm like, well, if it smells like fresh greens, it's parsley. If it smells like puke, it's cilantro. Just sniff it. Now, you can tell the difference, but if you don't cook with those 2 things a lot, they do look similar. They're kind of all parsley-like. Italian parsley, especially, rather than curly parsley, looks a lot like cilantro. But you can tell them apart. It just takes a little bit. And it's easier for them to ask you whether it's cilantro or parsley. And then you just tell them, which is weird because it's usually all the same price. But for their inventory, they need to know who's buying what so they know what to order. If you're going to be paying with a check, if you see somebody standing there with a checkbook in their hand, that always takes longer than it does to scan your card because while they're scanning things through, you can swipe your card and pay and get all that taken care of before they're even done doing their job. Alcohol. Somebody's checking alcohol and the checker is under 18, have to get a manager to or is under 21, have to get a manager to come over. So all of this information you can use to help you make decisions about the checkout line. Now, clearly, the more information you have, the better you can make that decision. The better the information is that you have, the better you can make that decision. And what's the currency that you're trying to minimize or maximize? What's the thing that you're trying to accomplish in doing this? Yeah, so the currency that you're paying attention to is time. So in this case, time is the currency, and you are trying to minimize time. Now, we've all been through the checkout lane at the grocery store. How many of us have ever been at the grocery store, gotten into the line, and then things just go terribly wrong? The person didn't have the checkbook out when you walked up, but they dig it out of their bag or their pocket as you're standing there. And then they get there, and they don't know if they're organic oranges or non-organic oranges, and the little peel tag that has the code on it has been peeled off, so they have to get a price check. And the ramen noodles that they bought, the fold of the plastic was sealed up when they sealed up the ramen noodles such that you can't get to the barcode, so they can't scan it, so then they have to sit there and peel it back and type the number in. And then you're standing there and you're going like, oh my God, I thought this would be faster. Because that person only has 7 items. But there's a problem with every one of them. You have experienced this? Of course, everybody's experienced this. And the reason that we run into this problem is because in spite of our best efforts to use the information that is available to us, that information is imperfect. And so sometimes, even though we're trying to make the best economic decisions that we can, in terms of minimizing the amount of time that we spend standing in the grocery line, there are times when that works well for us, and there are times that that doesn't work well for us, largely because we have imperfect information with which to make the decision. In a similar way, animals out there in nature are perhaps trying to minimize the amount of time that they have to spend foraging in order to get enough calories to survive from one day to the next, because the more time they spend out foraging, that means the more time they're exposed to predation, for example. And so animals can be time minimizers as well. You can also be an energy maximizer. You want to forage in a way such that you maximize the amount of energy that you get per unit time, which serves you in a couple ways. It gets you the energy that you need before the day is done, but it also might also simultaneously minimize the amount of time that you spend gathering those calories, et cetera, et cetera. So you can be an energy maximizer, you can be a time minimizer, but economic decisions are at the heart of a lot of animal behavior. So that's why here at the beginning of the text, they spend a whole chapter on it. I have a tickle in my nose from my mask. All right, so learning goals. You have to be able to apply economic thinking to animal behavior. I really have a tickle in my nose. And that's what this whole chapter is about, applying economic ideas to animal behavior. One of the things that you'll find is that the field of ecology and animal behavior has borrowed a bunch of ideas from the field of economics, and vice versa. The field of economics has also borrowed ideas from behavior and ecology, and there's this free flow of ideas between these two fields because the ideas are similar. Explain how diminishing returns curves operate and how they affect foraging and mating strategies. A diminishing return curve, do you guys know what that is? Nope. It's one of these curves where on the x-axis you have the amount of time or energy that you put into something versus the gain in whatever currency it is that you're thinking about. A good way of thinking about this is you guys studying for an exam. If you spend zero amount of time studying for an exam, your grade is probably going to be low. If you spend a little bit of time, your grade's probably going to improve fairly rapidly. Spend even more time, it's going to improve even more, but it's going to start to improve at a diminishing rate until there will come a point at which spending more time studying doesn't actually gain you anything. You understand the material well enough to make the grade that you want to make, and spending another 2 hours studying that material isn't going to probably have an appreciable effect on your grade, at which point you should stop studying, because you're just putting effort in where effort's not going to actually do you any good. This is what a diminishing return curve is. And you can apply these to all sorts of things in your life, but animals also apply them in their everyday decision making. The ideal free distribution is the shopping line. In theory, as consumers go up to the shopping queues at the store, everybody, in theory, has all of the same information. And so if everybody in the store is trying to reduce the amount of time that they have to stand in line, then they will all make decisions with that goal in mind, which means that they'll distribute themselves across the various lanes in a way that everybody spends the same amount of time in line. And that's what the ideal free distribution is about. And so we'll talk about that in more detail and figure out when that idea applies and when it doesn't apply. And then there's also this issue of risk in decision making. Every decision has risk associated with it. In the case of foraging, you might risk starvation. In the case of foraging, you might risk being preyed upon because you're out foraging and so you're exposing yourself. Organisms factor in this risk, and your decision scenario can change depending on what kinds of risks you're weighing and what the nature of those risks are. If you are on the verge of starvation, you may take a higher risk to get a food reward than you would if you were well fed, because you could reduce your risk of, for example, being preyed upon for a short period of time if you're well fed, because you have energy stores, and you can pass on that feeding opportunity and get a safer feeding opportunity that maybe comes down the line. So the state that you were in might affect how you assess risk and whether or not the risk to reward balance is worth engaging in. And then, of course, animals know how to learn. You can learn things about your environment that help you make these decision makings in the same way that you can learn the checkers at your grocery store. So being able to think about all these things and explain how these things operate is kind of the goal for the next 4 days. I think we have 4 days slated for this material. Questions about any of this? Okay. This is my couch. Whoa, what happened? This is my couch. There's my plug, my Apple plug. It's a couch. It's a fine couch. It's a little small because I have a small house, but it seats 2 people just fine, and that's all the people that I have to seat in my house. You guys know what Stickley Furniture is? This is furniture. It's made in upstate New York, Manlius, New York. It's a company that makes arts and crafts furniture. They've been making it since the late 1800s, early 1900s. This is made out of white oak. This is a Stickley settle, and there's a Stickley side table right next to it. This stuff is expensive. I saved for years before I bought this couch. This couch cost me $4,000. Yeah, I know. But this is a couch that I will pass on to my children, except I don't have any children. I'll pass it on to my nieces or nephews, whoever wants it. And it will serve them through their life. They will pass it on to their children. This is generational furniture. And so I put a certain amount of money into this, and it was an economic decision. And the economic decision that I made was, one of the reasons that this thing costs $4,000 is because, one, it's made in the United States. It's made by craftspeople who make a really good wage because they do really outstanding work. This thing is amazingly put together. They also get health care. They get paid time off. They get sick leave. They have a retirement plan. They harvest the trees in a sustainable way so that there are oak trees for future generations of cabinet makers and furniture makers, etc., etc. For me, the decision to buy this particular piece of furniture at the price point that it was at, it was worth it to me, not just because of the quality of the furniture, which is amazingly high, but also because of all of these other benefits that accrue to the purchase of this piece of furniture. This is an arts and crafts style love seat from Nebraska Furniture Mart. It is made from tropical woods, probably harvested either in South America or Southeast Asia. Those woods are harvested not in a sustainable way, probably put together by low-wage workers who don't have health care, don't have safe working conditions, don't have a retirement plan, etc., etc. And this thing still costs like $1,000. But in that $1,000, one of the reasons that it is $1,000 is because of all of this other stuff that I don't really agree with. I think we should provide workers with safe working places. I think we should give them living wages. I think they should have health care and health insurance. I think that they should have a retirement plan so that they don't have to work until the day that they die, et cetera, et cetera. And so I make the conscious decision to buy one thing versus another thing because as a human, I try and live out my values in my purchasing choices to the degree that I can. But that's what an economic decision is. It's basically balancing the cost of something versus the reward. I sit my butt in that couch every night. I read my animal behavior book. I look over my PowerPoints. I code in R in that couch. I live my life at home on that couch when I'm not doing other things like going on bike rides and stuff like that. I spend a lot of time in that chair. I like the values that that chair represents. So I'm happy to have saved for like 4 years so that I could afford that particular piece of furniture. This piece of furniture is also not going to last. I would have used this piece of furniture for 10 years or 15 years and then probably had to throw it away and get a new one because this one is probably not going to hold up the way this one is, which this one will live, this one will survive me and generations of people after me. So there's also this idea of long-term gain versus short-term gain. If I really needed a settle, I would have gotten this one because I really needed a place to sit. But I got divorced in 2009, and for 3 years after I got divorced, I didn't need a couch because I didn't have anybody to sit with on a couch. So I had my armchair, which is also a Stickley armchair. It is not in this picture. It's over there somewhere. So I could afford to just sit around in my armchair and not get a couch for 3 years. So all these things go into making economic decisions. So decision making is informed by analysis of the cost and benefit of the various choices that are available to an individual. I can choose to shop at the Nebraska Furniture Mart, or I can choose to order my furniture from this company in New York. It's clear the choices I've made about my life, and I regret some of them, but most of them I feel pretty happy about. All of this relies on the quality of the available information. I know a lot about Stickley Furniture. Part of the reason that I know about Stickley Furniture is I do woodworking and I make some furniture myself. I built all the cabinetry in my kitchen. I also built all the cabinetry in my downstairs bathroom. So I also know what good quality woodworking is, and that informs my decision about the kinds of things that I make. My wife and I were just at a furniture store Saturday. We were killing time while we were waiting for family to arrive at a restaurant. And we went into this furniture store, and they had this kind of table that was pretty well designed, but when I started paying attention to the way it was built, the legs had a really kind of clever design to them, but when I looked at it carefully, they were held together with brad nails. And brad nails are these little thin wire nails that you shoot into pieces of wood with a little gun. And they're nice sometimes to hold a piece of wood in place while you're gluing it or something like that. But you don't want that to be the main way in which you're holding together a piece of furniture, because eventually those brad nails are going to wiggle loose and the thing is going to fall apart. And Elizabeth, my wife, was like, "Oh, that's a cool design." And then I started looking at it. I'm like, "Yeah, but it's really terribly made, because it was put together in such a way that it's not going to stay together over long periods of time." And I'm like, I could make this table, and I kind of like the design, the way the legs are designed and how the chairs fit under it and things like that. But I would do it with traditional joinery, because that is a type of joinery that would last, as opposed to this thing that was still like $1,600 for a dining room table. And dining room tables are just expensive. It's just not going to last. And I could tell it's not going to last by looking at how it was put together. So, quality of information is super important. The better your information is, the better decisions that you can make. And of course, it requires certain cognitive capacities for the organism making the decision. If I didn't know anything about woodworking, I might look at that table and say, "Oh, that's a perfectly appropriate table. Let's get that. We kind of need a new dining room table." But because I have the cognitive ability to look at that thing critically and say, "No, I'm not going to do that," I now am going to have to make my own dining room table with my own two hands, because I know it's going to be made well then. So, are you Wisconsin Badgers fans? No. This is a Wisconsin Badger. University of Wisconsin, that's their mascot. Imagine that you are a badger and you're out foraging at night, and you enter into a field and you start wandering around looking for little field mice to eat. And as you wander around, you may wander around and then you encounter a field mouse. Well, when you watch a badger out in a field foraging, what you will see is when they encounter one field mouse, oftentimes what they will do is they will tighten their search. It's like, "Oh, I found one rodent here. There might be a family of rodents here. There might be a den that rodents are using. So I'm going to concentrate my search there." And in the process of doing that, you find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rodents, and you miss 2 rodents. But as you find those rodents, your odds of finding the next rodent go down, because you've already found that rodent, so now there are fewer rodents in there to find. You miss that one, you find that one, so now there are 2 fewer rodents. And over time, the rate at which you discover rodents goes down. And because you're the badger doing the discovery, you know kind of how it's going. You're either continuing to find rodents, or it's becoming harder to find rodents, partly because you have depleted the supply of rodents there. And then there comes a point where you keep searching, and it's like, "I'm not finding anything. I must have eaten all the rodents that are here." And then you start wandering around looking for more rodents. You almost find that guy, but you don't. You pass him by until you encounter another rodent. And you're like, "Oh, more rodents. Let's look around for some more rodents." Encounter that one, but then you've eaten 2 of the 3 that are there. So you don't find the third one. You look around for a while. Your success falls because you found the 2 that were easy to find. And so then you start wandering around. These are patches, and these patches vary in quality. Some patches are low quality because they have very little resource in them. Other ones are medium quality, and others are high quality. The higher the quality of the patch, in theory, the longer you would stay in the patch, because the patch doesn't deplete as quickly. And so there are good reasons why you might wander around in this patch longer than you would wander around in this patch, simply because as you wander around this patch, you're depleting the food that is there, but there's still more food there to be had. And then this basically is quantified in an idea put forth by Eric Charnoff in the 1970s. And this is called the marginal value theorem. And it's basically a way of predicting how does the badger know when to leave this patch. How does the badger know when to leave this patch? How does the badger know when to leave this patch? When to give up, in a sense. Well, for any given patch type, high quality, low quality, medium quality, there is a curve which describes how much time you spend in the patch relative to how much you get out of that patch. This is the diminishing returns curve that I showed you earlier. The longer you stay in the patch, the less you get out per unit time because you are depleting the resources that are in that patch. The longer you stay, the rate at which you get something out of that activity goes down. So remember that whenever you want to know what the rate of change is, you can just lay a tangent along the curve, and the slope of the line of that tangent is the rate at which y is changing relative to x. Early on in the patch, the slope is really steep, meaning that you're gaining a lot for being in that patch a really small amount of time. Spend more time, you're gaining less per unit time in the patch. The slope is shallower until there comes a point where the slope is flat, where spending more time in the patch doesn't gain you anything more in terms of what you're trying to get out of the patch. This is a low quality patch because it has a lower curve overall than this patch, which has a higher curve. At any point along this curve, you're experiencing a higher rate, a higher slope than you are here. If we were to draw a line down to the x-axis, the slope of the line at the tangent there is shallower than the slope of the line at the tangent there, meaning that you're getting a higher rate of return here than you are here. So, one of the things that you have to assume when you think of a badger foraging in these patches of field mice is you would have to assume that the badger is capable of knowing, assessing what kind of patch it's in. And that's reasonable because it may detect early on, well, overall, I'm just experiencing a lower rate of return, so this must be a poor patch, versus when I first enter a patch, I'm experiencing a higher rate of return, so I must be in a higher quality patch. But then what determines when should you give up? I've been in patch type 2 for a certain amount of time. When should I give up? Should you stay in there this long? Why not? Yeah, it's been a while since you haven't really gained anything. So then the question is, well, where, once it started flattening out, where in this deceleration of the curve should you decide to give up and go to greener pastures? What might determine that decision? And you can see this if you look ahead, but think about it this way before you look ahead. What in this thing might tell you, give you some insight into what might affect your decision? Yeah, so how long does it take you to travel from one patch to another? And as it turns out, travel time between patches is crucial. And so if this is the amount of time that it takes you to travel, the way you can calculate how much time you should stay in each of these patches given a constant travel time is just by drawing a tangent to the curve. If this is the rate of gain within a patch, and this is the amount of time that it takes to get from one patch to another, this is the amount of time that I should stay in the patch, because at that point, I'm maximizing the amount of energy that I'm getting out of that patch, if energy is the currency that is being examined. It's going to be a different time for patch 2, though, because the tangent from here to there is going to be different. And so in patch 2, because it's a lower quality patch, you should actually stay in that patch a little longer because overall, you've gotten less energy out of that patch. And if it takes a certain amount of energy to get from one patch to another, you need to have enough energy so that you survive from this patch to the next patch. And so you stay in lower quality patches longer because they're just generally less productive rather, given a constant travel time. Now you can also have variable travel times where you can have patches that are far apart from one another versus patches that are close together. And near patches, you should stay in for shorter periods of time simply because they're near. Patch quality hasn't changed, but if the patches are far apart, you should stay longer. If the patches are closer together, you should stay a shorter period of time because you leave that patch when you're having the highest rate of return for the time that you're spending in that patch. And if you leave that patch earlier, you get a higher rate of return, and the next patch that you go to is really close. So you don't really lose anything moving from patch to patch because these patches are closer together. This is the kind of economic analysis that behavioral ecologists make when they're trying to figure out how organisms make decisions. These are graphical, but the graphic models are very important because there's also underlying mathematical properties of these curves that build the graphs that determine what the curve shapes are. So we have patch residence times for type 1 for near patches, patch type 2 for near patches, patch type 1 for far patches, and patch type 2 for far patches. And so these models should be kind of intuitive in terms of thinking like what should a particular individual do in a given environment. Questions about that? This is just a general framework for thinking about these things. Specific examples in your book are starlings catching insects and bringing those insects back to the nest, because finches are gathering things up in their beaks. There comes a point at which gathering more in their beaks becomes unproductive because as they open their beak to put another insect in there, they risk losing insects that are already in their beak. And so the load in terms of how many insects they can carry at once exhibits a diminishing return curve, just like so many other things do. There comes a point where trying to add another insect to your beak doesn't really gain you much. But depending on how far you have to go from where your patch is, from where your nest is, to where you're finding the insects, that might influence how much you want to stuff in your beak before you make the trip back. Because the further away you are, the more energy you're using to get back and forth. And that also decreases the rate at which you're provisioning these offspring. And all those little beaks in that nest box, those are growing, energetically expensive offspring that need to be replenished at a particular rate. So we can look at this decision from the same perspective, where we look at the amount of time searching. The more you search, the more insects that you gather. But once again, you gather those at a diminishing return. The longer you search, the more you get, but the rate at which you acquire new things goes down over time. But then where you decide to cut it off, this is referred to as the giving up time, the point at which you give up on whatever that activity is in this case. Finding new insects, that point is ultimately determined by, once again, how far you had to travel to that patch which is providing these prey. If the travel time between patches is short, you make one decision. If the travel time is long, you make another decision. And so you can gather these data in terms of, you could put a starling in a patch with insects and you could determine how long it takes them to gather a certain number of insects, and you can quantify the shape of that curve. And then you could put patches of insects at different distances away from starlings so that you have manipulated the time that it takes to travel to those patches of insects. And then once you've done that, you can basically ask the question, do the birds behave in a way that the model predicts? And when you do that, oftentimes what you find is that the prediction that you make for the bird's behavior matches actually what the birds do when they're out there doing their thing, in this case foraging for insects in these patches. If the model predicts the behavior well, then you've kind of quantified the kinds of things that the animal is paying attention to. If for some reason the data of what the animals are actually performing does not match the predictions of the model, then there's something wrong with your model that is not predicting the behavior very well. So you have to figure out what it is that might be off. Is it the currency that I'm paying attention to isn't the correct currency? Is it that I've not estimated the shape of the diminishing returns curve properly? Is it that I've underestimated or overestimated travel time, for example? And so all those things could be off. In this case, the people who did the study, they based that returns curve on the basis of the rate of return of the number of prey items to the offspring, rather than the energy that was being gained by the offspring. And as it turns out, the model fit better when you were looking at the rate of return in terms quantified as number of prey items rather than the total caloric count of the prey items. So you can imagine for a bird, it's pretty easy for a bird to count things. Oh, I'm a starling. I know I have 6 things in my mouth. Some of those things might be big, some of those things might be small, such that I don't have a very good measure of the caloric content of the 6 things in my mouth. But what I do know is that I have 6 things in my mouth, and it's going to take me 10 more minutes to find a 7th thing. So I'll wait 10 more minutes and find that 7th thing, because when I find that 7th thing, it's going to take me 20 more minutes to find the 8th thing. And so the currency that ended up fitting the model best was the count of the number of insects rather than the calories in the number of insects, very possibly because count is something that is within the cognitive abilities of a bird to assess, whereas calories of those items probably isn't. And so you can get poor fit to the model because you're paying attention to the wrong currency that the organism might be paying attention to. So there's a certain degree to which you have to kind of get inside the head of the organisms that you're studying when you study animal behavior, because if you're thinking about their goals differently than they're thinking about their goals, you're going to find that you're not very good at predicting what they're going to do. Questions? Once again, marginal value theorem. In this case, we have flies, dung flies. What dung flies do is they go to cow patties. There's a cow patty. And when it's fresh, females will come to the cow patty to lay eggs in the dung. When it's fresh and wet, that's good for their larvae. The larvae get to eat the dung, and then they grow up to be dung flies and repeat the whole process again. So when they get there, inevitably, there are male dung flies sitting there waiting for the females to arrive. And so males have to decide, once a female arrives, they have to acquire the female, but then when they have acquired the female, they have to decide how long they're going to stay copulating with her. Because the longer you copulate, the more of your sperm you get to transfer to her. But of course, what happens the longer you stay with the female in terms of sperm transfer? It's a diminishing returns curve. What might lead to it being a diminishing returns curve? Anatomically, physiologically. Any ideas? When you first start copulating, you transfer a lot of sperm, which fertilizes a big proportion of the eggs. As time goes on, you fertilize fewer and fewer eggs, partly because there's just fewer eggs to fertilize. What are other reasons why you might see this diminishing returns curve? You might have fewer sperm because you've already transferred a lot of sperm over, and so you're running out of sperm supply if you're the male. What's another reason you might see this diminishing returns curve? Oftentimes females store sperm, and so the spermatheca, which is the little pouch where sperm gets stored by the female, those have a limited volume, and so kind of once you filled up that volume of sperm storage, making more sperm available to her doesn't really gain you anything in terms of the number of eggs fertilized. But it looks to me like from this chart that the main thing that's going on is there comes a point at which you have fertilized all the eggs that there are to fertilize in that female. But you shouldn't stay until you fertilized all the eggs in that female. You should leave before then, because if you do, you're not having the maximum rate of fertilization that you could have if you stopped earlier. And so, once again, the amount of time that you should stay in copulation with a female is determined by the rate at which staying with the female increases the number of eggs that are fertilized, but that's always put within the framework of how long is it going to take me to find another female, and how long do I have to guard her in order to get the copulation process going. And so searching and guarding time is important, which basically means that these males should cut off time considerably shorter than the time that you would need to be copulating in order to get 100% of the eggs fertilized, because once again, that maximizes the rate. So you reach your maximum rate of egg fertilization as a male down here around 80% of the eggs fertilized, at which point, if you stick around longer, you're basically just wasting time. Because you're gaining more eggs fertilized, but you would gain more eggs fertilized if you just found a fresh female that hadn't been mated already. Now, what's one of the things you need to know as a male in making this decision? You need to have a way of knowing whether or not a female is already mated with another male, because if you leave this female that you currently have in favor of another female who's already spent, 45 minutes with a male, you're going to be getting to this female at this part of the curve, not at this part of the curve. And so as a result of that, you will have made an uninformed decision, because it's a decision where you didn't know what the state of the female was. You also need to have some idea of what the rate of arrival of females are at the dung pat that you're at. So the quality of the dung pat might have an effect on your decision making. Fresh dung pats generally attract more females than old dung pats do. So a fresh dung pat, the search time may be considerably shorter. An older dung pat that's drier has fewer females arriving, so that search time might be longer, which then affects what the optimal time is to copulate with a female. I oftentimes find it useful to take these behaviors of animals and interpret them in light of commonly accessible things that humans do. And this is especially true of the next example. So do you have any questions about dung pats and dung flies and copulation? This is just the marginal value theorem again. This figure looks a little different, but it's also a diminishing returns curve. In this case, we're looking at the space between flowers, how long it takes to travel from flower to flower, which is interpatch interval essentially. But in this case, they're looking at bees. And as bees move from flower to flower, they're gaining two things. They're gaining nectar that they drink, so that they have a crop, part of their digestive system, where they store nectar that they've lapped out of flowers. And they also pick up pollen. So as a bee is foraging, the bee gets heavier and heavier. And as it gets heavier and heavier, when it flies back to the hive, it takes more and more energy to fly as it spends more time foraging. So there comes a point when you've been out in the field foraging so much that it is very energy expensive to then fly back to the hive. So you have to once again decide, when do you need to give up foraging in order to make it back to the hive? Well, as it turns out, the further away the hive is from the flowers, the sooner you stop foraging. So can you think of a similar kind of example that would be relatable to this? The idea that the further away a resource is, the less of that resource you carry back to where you live and where you're going to consume that resource. If you're close, you can... Sorry, this is the number of flowers. So this is the distance between flowers versus the number of times that you visit those flowers. And so if you are... The further the flowers are away, the fewer flowers you're going to visit because the travel time to those flowers is so great. You're going to make fewer trips essentially, whereas the closer those flowers are, the more willing you are to make more trips because each trip is at less energetic cost. Can you guys think of a situation where this happens? My house looks like this. There's a patio, and as a result, my driveway looks like this. And when it gets here to the patio, it scooches out like this, such that one of the cars sits here and one of the cars sits here. The walkway to the front door basically goes from the back of this nearest car to the front door. Started out today's talk talking about groceries. When I get home and there's a bunch of grocery bags in my car, what is going to be my behavior if I drove car A to the grocery store? let's say I have 10 bags. Well, I might not take all 10 because why? I have a shorter trip. If I take more trips back and forth, it's not that big of a deal because it's closer. Although it's not super a lot closer. But if I was further away, I might tend to load up more bags so that I make fewer trips, because the trip then becomes the energy user. If something happens and I'm having a party and we didn't do a great job of planning for the party, and as a result I am getting to the party with the supplies for the party after other people have arrived and parked in my driveway, and now I have to park on Kansas Street, I'm way more likely to stick them all on my arm, all the plastic bags hanging off my arm, using all my body strength, my legs, my torso, my arms, everything, to get all the bags to the door so that I don't have to go all the way back out to the street in order to bring them in. If it's a far distance, you're going to make fewer trips than if it's a short distance, because the trip itself requires energy. And this is the case with grocery bags. The other thing that I like to do, Elizabeth's mom makes grocery bags out of feed sacks from the farm store. Chicken feed, they're really, really durable. So she makes these big sacks because they carry a bunch of stuff. And when I go to the store, I try and carry those because I can just load those up. And then I have 2 bags. But the 2 bags are like equivalent of 5 bags or 6 bags of the little plastic bags from the grocery store. And as long as I can lift it, I'll just trudge it in, once again, to avoid making more trips. I will increase my load in order to make fewer trips if the distance is further away. And it's this interaction between load size, distance, and the energetic costs of covering that distance that become important. So, as we think about these things, try and put them in everyday terms that relate to things that you have familiarity with. We won't get to it today because we really don't have time to cover it, and to start covering it and then pick it up again on Wednesday will just confuse you. But pray choice, think about pray choice in terms of doing things like going to the cafeteria. When you go to the cafeteria, you have all this food to choose from. A lot of times you make choices on what you're going to eat by kind of what you're in the mood for that day, but that's not how animals normally approach that sort of decision making. They look at their prey choices in terms of the energy that is to be gained from those prey and how long it takes to handle those prey. So when I think about prey choice, you have to think about the energy that you gain versus the amount of energy that you put into processing that. So I always think of popcorn shrimp versus lobster. You guys ever had lobster? Never had lobster? Crab. Okay, crab works. You guys have crab? What do you have to do with crab? You have to crack it open. You have to pull it out. It's always falling apart. Once you have it out, you have to dip it in the butter and eat it. It's a certain amount of work. Sometimes they give you a little hammer to crack the legs with. You got to hammer it, peel away the exoskeleton, dig out the flesh, and then eat it. What do you have to do for popcorn shrimp? Just pop them in your mouth. They're both shellfish. They have kind of similar flavors, kind of similar textures. But one is so much more work for the amount of energy that you get out of. So when you think about prey choice, think about the difference between eating crab or lobster and eating something like shrimp. If they both have similar energy content, but one of them requires much less processing, much less handling in terms of time and or energy, then one of them is much more profitable than the other one. And it's this ratio of energy gained versus energy or time spent handling that determines how profitable something is. Two things have similar energy but different handling times, then one is going to be more profitable, and the one that is more profitable is the one that requires less handling. At the same time, shrimp, all the shrimp, each shrimp is smaller than each lobster. So there might be a ratio. This ratio, the lobster has a lot of energy, but also has a lot of handling time. Each individual shrimp has lower energy in each shrimp, but also has significantly lower handling time. So you really have to calculate the ratio to know which one is the more profitable. You can't just necessarily look at it, because with the crab or the lobster, you get a lot of energy out of it, but you also have to put a lot of energy into it. The shrimp, you get very little energy out of each one, but you also put hardly energy into each one. So you really have to do the math on what those two things are to know which one is more profitable. And in theory, and based on a lot of studies that have been done, animals are surprisingly good at complicated math. They're not technically doing the math, but they have ways of processing information that they get at the math accurately without having the ability to do math. I'll try and remember to bring a racquetball in on Wednesday and demonstrate to you what I mean by the difference between doing the math versus sensing the math. Okay? And that'll be it for today. Questions? All right. And Elizabeth, you're coming over to the office to talk to me? All right. Does this seem to make intuitive sense to you? Okay, good. All right.